Hello everyone, this is Pastor Dirk and welcome to our first devotional in the series, Who is God? This past Sunday we examined that question and we determined that in order to know who God truly is, we need to examine His story. We can't just guess about who the God beyond us might be. God has taken the time and developed a story through history through this particular people of Israel. And it's by looking at that story, reflecting on that story, that we can actually determine who God is. And so what I'd like to do today briefly is look at one of those stories in the bigger story of God, in which God reveals Himself. The great God who is beyond us reveals Himself and lets us know something about Himself. And to do that, I want to look at a period in time, some 850 BC. I would say it's probably about 150 years after David lived and wrote that psalm. The people of God began to deteriorate rapidly, fall away from God. In fact, the kingdom was divided into two parts, a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom. And in the northern kingdom, known as Israel, God sent a prophet, first Elijah and then his successor Elisha. And this particular story takes place when Elisha was the prophet in that northern territory known as Israel. And at this particular time, Israel was in a very difficult place. A neighboring country, a country by the name of Aram, the Arameans, we would now know that area as Syria, they decide to attack. And they surround the capital city of Israel, a city known as Samaria. And when they surrounded, they put the city into siege. In those ancient days, a siege can be deadly. What they do is they surround the city and cut off all the food supply and all water, so the people literally inside, they literally starve to death and dehydrate to death. It was a terrible, terrible situation. The story, as it's told in the book of 2 Kings, it's such a devastating story. I mean, they're eating like dead donkey heads that they pay exorbitant prices for. They even are at the place where they're eating their own children and sacrificing them. It's just terribly disgusting. So they're in this terrible, terrible situation. But the king is powerless to deliver them. There's nothing he can do. This huge army is surrounding the city. They're afraid to leave the city. And the king is just so frustrated, he doesn't know what to do. And of course, like all of us, who sometimes we run into these challenging circumstances, he's blaming God. He's angry at God, and he's angry at Elisha, because Elisha is this powerful servant of God, and he won't speak up. He won't deliver the people. And so things are very desperate, but everybody seems powerless to solve this problem. Then we see a miracle. There are a few lepers, 4 of them. Lepers that's the word we use for a type of skin disease that was prevalent there. And it was very much contagious. And so those folks in that community, they were ostracized. They weren't allowed to be in the community. So these 4 lepers are an even more difficult situation. Not only were they part of the starving people, they were ostracized from the people that were left. And so the story goes that they got together and they decided that they were going to do something about it. They felt like their die was cast. They were going to die no matter what happened. So they decided to give up to the Arameans. They were going to leave the city of Samaria and just go give up. But then God does something astounding. Look at what we read in the text. At dusk, that is the evening, they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. And when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. God had scattered the enemy. When the lepers arrived there, they saw an empty camp. This reinforces to us who God is. He is the sovereign God. With just a sound, He dispels an entire army. This army, they got a rumor going. They thought for sure what had happened is the king of Israel had hired these mercenaries, the Hittites or the Egyptians, to come. And these Arameans were afraid and scared, and they ran off. Amazing, isn't it? The sovereign God, He just implanted this fear in their heart. This demonstrates to us how powerful this God beyond us can be, how he can dispel enemies with just a flick of the wrist. He changes them like he changes clothes. There's just, they stand no chance in his power. Which of course begs the question, why does God allow them to have any victory at all? Why isn't he just constantly delivering the people from their pain? Well, it turns out that so often in the story of God, these things, they're a judgment of sin, and God allows them to creep into people's lives in part to get their attention. See, what had happened is over the years, especially since David and Solomon, people had fallen farther and farther away from God. And so sometimes God has to allow that judgment to creep into a broken world to get our attention. And so here it was, this situation where judgment was creeping in, all the terrible things happening because of the people rebelling against their God. And they're crying out to God. They're even angry at God. And God in his mercy and grace shows up and delivers. But notice he delivers through these 4 lepers. Look what happens. Then the men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. They took silver and gold and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. Wow. You see, these lepers who had nothing, now all of a sudden they had everything to themselves. All the great wealth and provisions of this enemy, it now belonged to these lepers. The people who had nothing now had everything. And the people who had thrown them out, were ostracizing them back in the city of Samaria, they had nothing. God did all this. He got rid of the army that had everything. Now they have nothing. He gave to the people who had nothing, everything. See, this tells us that human circumstances, they change overnight. The haves become have-nots, and the have-nots become the haves. These things get changed around. And so that gives us a warning on both sides. If we are people that have, if we're in authority, we ought to beware, because we have that only for the time being. At any moment, the circumstances can change. For us, the key is to understand that God owns it all. He owns all the authority. He owns all the power. He decides who can survive this crazy world. And so to those wealthy, he's calling them back. But to the poor and to the leper, he encourages them. God hears them. He knows their situation. He's walking through that situation with them. In fact, this Sunday, if you come back, we're going to talk about the fact that God is with us, and God is clearly there this time with the weak, the people who understand they have nothing. But then something happens to those people who have everything, who are now enriched beyond belief. Look what that happened. Then they said to each other, "What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace." See, these people who now had everything, they were delivered, they were saved, and they realized, even these folks realized, what we're doing isn't right. We shouldn't keep this all ourselves. There are people starving, people who need this. See, to me, this is such a story of humanity, isn't it? We have nothing, and then God takes care of us and he provides for us. And we ought to be like these folks who, even though maybe they weren't the closest persons in terms of faith, maybe they had given up, even they understand, you got to get back. There are people out there still starving, and these people understood that it was their obligation. In fact, they were a little afraid that God might judge them if they don't give back to the people who are hurting. And so they go back to the city and let the city know that there is this great provision and God has provided. Now, the bigger part of this story, the wrapping around this story, both before and after, is that Elisha had predicted all this. God had predicted that he was going to give all this provision. And people did not want to believe. It was impossible. He tells them that they'll be able to go to buy wheat for cheap. Couple dozen pounds for like $7. It was impossible for the economy to turn around that quickly. But Elisha predicted it. And sure enough, it came true. See, this is something God does over and over again in his scriptures as well. He makes a prediction. He says up front what's going to happen. Often it's an impossible thing. And then when it happens, there's a reference to the fact that God knows. God predicts. So that we're clear that this was not an accident. This was not just a circumstance. This is not random. This is God acting to show us something about who he is. That God is all-powerful. He can do all things. Always looking for his faithfulness. Whether you have a lot or whether you have a little, he's just asking for faithfulness. You know, this world is a messed up place. We don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. Our fortunes turn over, it seems, all the time. Seems uncertain, scary even. But in this story, we learn that the God is beyond us will show up. He has all power. The only certainty in this world is God and his power and his desire to be with his people. This whole story should just call us to faithfulness. Whether we have a lot or little, let's rely upon this God who is always there, who always cares, who is not just the God beyond us, but is also the God with us. Well, thank you for joining me on this story. It's in 2 Kings chapter 7 if you want to go back and read it again. Fascinating story. One of many stories where God shows up. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again on Sunday as we continue this series on Who is God.